I'm joined today by, I would say, Sankara, because we're friends. You might know him as Dr. Sankara, joining us from India today. Where are you exactly, Dr. Sankara, and how are you?
I'm very well, and I'm beaming out from Chennai in the southern part of India.
It's an incredible world we live in today, right? I mean, the last time you and I spoke, it was about 5 years ago on a stage at the University of Toronto,
Right.
where we were doing a, I don't know, do we want to say a debate, a conversation between yourself and Dan
Barker.
Barker, who is an avowed socialist, perhaps not anymore after that evening. Well, I don't know. I haven't talked to him in a while. But as we sit here today in the year 2018, you're in India, I'm in Canada, yet we have the chance to speak, which in some ways I think is an interesting segue to the conversation today. Because we're talking in a lot of ways about, you know, we'll talk about globalization, we'll talk about the oneness that underlies all people, especially when we're talking about interfaith. We're talking about trying to find the common denominator that will ultimately get us past years, centuries, millennia of divisiveness and set us on a new path. Let's call it Humanity 2.0, where we are functioning as an interconnected group rather than a divided group. And interconnected means interdependent. This is at the crux what you talk about a lot, but it doesn't start with just a mental realization. It starts with deeper work. But first of all, talk about why this idea of interplanetary global harmony and peace, as it's been called, as you've called it, is not only a priority for you, it's something that you really believe we can realize together.
Richard, actually, it's not a theme which has been kind of put on the table by me. It is a theme which has been placed on the table by the Parliament of the World's Religions, and they are studying macrocosmic society, that is society at the collective level. And they find that throughout human history, there has been a recurring pattern of interreligious conflict, and then conflict between nation and nation, conflict between one class in society and another class, and all of these conflicts getting in the way of world peace. So the people in the apex body of the Parliament of the World's Religions, they're very concerned about this. And I believe they are extremely sincere people. They're looking for solutions. And therefore, I suggested that we address that very historically outstanding problem of interreligious conflict and international conflict and world peace, but now approaching it from the perspective of self-knowing, which is a completely new thing in so far as the world's religions are concerned. So that's where I'm getting into the door.
Well, it's interesting. You say it's a new thing. I think some might argue it's actually quite an old thing that has been overlooked or neglected, because you can find the kernels of this type of guidance throughout scriptures in the world, but religion hasn't necessarily understood or adopted this idea of self-knowing, and has become, over the course of again centuries, less about personal transformation and inner work and more about rules, dogma, and sticking a flag in the ground and defending it, essentially. We'll get to that in a second, but you mentioned the Parliament of World Religions. Very interesting. I think when people hear that, a lot of people will sort of sit up and pay attention to, wow, that sounds really interesting. I've never, maybe I've never heard of this organization, or I've heard of them, but I can't remember what their history is. The history is very interesting in that, in some ways, they're a very old organization, but then in other ways, they're kind of new. Explain how they kind of came on the scene almost, more than 100 years ago, went away, and are now back, and hopefully part of the solution going forward.
Right. You see, the first international meeting of the Parliament of the World's Religions happened way back 125 years ago in 1893. And on that occasion, there was a momentous address by Swami Vivekananda from India, who unveiled the face of India, which was significant in that India was a land where already people of 7 different religions, they were peacefully coexisting together. And that was an amazing thing, because already from world history, we have any number of examples of interreligious conflicts happening along with international conflicts. And therefore, India was an example for studying as to how a nation was getting along without really serious interreligious conflict. So Swami Vivekananda's momentous address is also considered to have spawned and set a going the interfaith movement in the world. Now I must say why the interfaith movement and the interreligious movement have become very important throughout the world, because we live in a globalizing world where practically all the people from all the religions and from all the cultures, people who look very different from us, who speak very different from us, different languages, and whose habits and lifestyles are different, they've all become our neighbors, and they might have very well become even our family members. And honestly speaking, because the human self has a sense of divisiveness in its mentality, and it has got a sense of separation, not only in optical perception, but in thought and feeling. Now, this is very difficult ground for the human self, because the human self feels threatened when it faces the challenge of meeting and mingling with alien peoples who speak a different language, who have a different religion, who have a different belief set, and whose lifestyle is different. So now the self is on shaky ground. Therefore, the Parliament of the World's Religions has really very sound motivation for asking everybody to come and gather at a certain place for discussing how human beings are going to solve this very outstanding problem, which has surfaced more pronouncedly in the last 100 years. Real globalization started probably with Columbus stepping onto American soil, the landfall in 1496 and so on. But much before aviation technology, globalization had started, because there were many maritime nations, and alien peoples are having the challenge of meeting and mingling with each other. And therefore, starting with 1893, the Parliament of the World's Religions launched a movement which is the need of the hour, so to speak. And the next time they met was after 100 years in 1993. And thereafter they're meeting every 3 years or every 5 years. And the apex body is extremely serious. I have researched into their credentials, and they are looking for solutions to problems, and they don't seem to know how to actually address these problems.
Well, I mean, I think we'd all agree that whoever claimed to know at this point would probably either be delusional or lying, because it is, as you highlighted, it's a historical issue, and it's even more. I'm glad you touched on. I would even say it's an anthropological issue. This fear of the other that you cited earlier, that goes back to our wiring as fight or flight. I mean, back as far back as 10 and 20,000 years, when part of survival was to be able to notice what was different from you, a saber-toothed tiger, whatever it was, and be able to have the physiological response of fear so that you could save yourself. But it's interesting to me, and I know I'm in this is a rare instance where I'm speaking not only to somebody with a strong pedigree on the spiritual side, it's also somebody who is a scientist, a man of science. And to me, I'm interested to know whether you believe that this is ultimately a faith-based or spirituality-based issue, or is it a science and human physiology, human biology? Because to me, it's a bridge to the inner knowing, or the self-knowing work, because really what you highlighted when you talked about how we all started, you know, through globalization to have more experience with the other and differences. Well, what is that? That's our external selves. That's the senses. That's what we see. You know, the person looks different. They sound different. They talk different. So if we're functioning from that external self, the false self, let's call it, of course, where do we end up? We end up with division, competition, and whatever. So it seems that without the self-knowing work, the inner work and understanding that, there is no ability to truly transcend the divisiveness on this planet. Is that a fair statement?
That is, you're almost homing into the bullseye. And, but you see, we have got to look at the problem not as Richard and Sankara, who are two individuals who may be very concerned about the direction in which the human civilization is headed. But we have got to look at the problem as leaders in society, religious leaders, social leaders, political leaders, and they have the problem of addressing this conflict between one class of people and another class of people, people of one religion and people of another religion. And so they're dealing with problems at the macrocosmic level, as I like to put it. And now nobody has done an etiology, that is a diagnosis of the social malaise in the macrocosmic society. And, but you're attempting to solve it in an ad hoc fashion using common sense. So how do we do this? We do this by creating a framework of rules and legislations and regulations, and expecting people who are in the society to conform and become obedient to those rules and legislations and regulations. Now this is the shape and the course of human history. Whether you make the legislation and the regulation in the field of religion, or in the field of social change, or in the field of political change, irrespective of the dominion where you're making it, you're saying everybody fall in line, everybody come into this wavelength, and everybody become obedient. Now, you can make those rules because that is kind of reformatory patchwork, which is necessary because it's like giving first aid to a person who's been injured in an accident. The first aid may be necessary, but these solutions do not go deep enough. Therefore, the problem surfaces next month, next year, it surfaces in another country, it surfaces after 5 years in another religion. So you see a recurring pattern. And therefore I say that first of all, before we venture to even look at this problem, we have got to set about on the task of determining the etiology. What is the root malaise? There is indeed a social malaise, which we see in religion, which we see in society, which we see in politics, the politics between nations. But then where is the genesis? Where is the starting point? How do you track down, like tracking down a criminal? How do you track it down?
It's interesting, but that's an interesting analogy, because you can apply the same methodology as when you track down a criminal. You look for clues, you identify the problem, and you create a path to ultimately uncover the problem, which is what you're talking about. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that there are people that have attempted to do this and have done an excellent job of articulating some of this social malaise that you're talking about. But it seems that relatively recent history, we seem to miss these leaders, these thought leaders, these sometimes ascended masters who have come up at certain points in the past to be able to give us that guidance. Somebody that that obviously you're very familiar with. I'd like you to talk about a little bit in terms of what your relationship was there and how his work influenced the work that you're doing today, especially around this idea of self-knowing, and that's J. Krishnamurti. Now, interesting to me that whenever we're citing these people who had really strong influence, often ahead of their time, right? Often they're talking about things that aren't really appreciated fully until they're long past, because often their ideas that at the time, because of this social malaise or the undercurrents of political and dogmatic differences, that it's not able to be fully understood and processed. But J. Krishnamurti, other people that will come up, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, there's a bunch of examples, but they're never necessarily political leaders or church leaders. They're people that are coming from the mass populace through divine inspiration, through whatever exact way they arrive. And they're the people that are ultimately able to diagnose this social malaise you're talking about and be able to take the step further in terms of being able to lay out what is needed and what the potential solutions are. And often it's not what people want to hear. Talk about how J. Krishnamurti's work was very similar to that the medicine, it's good for you, but nobody likes the taste.
You said it. You said it. All right. You see, the master Krishnamurti, we can call him a master, or we can call him a religious teacher or a philosopher, whichever way you want to see him. He was groomed to be the world teacher by the Theosophical Society, was discovered in India by Bishop Leadbeater and Annie Besant of the Theosophical Society. And then Krishnamurti was watching how that religious organization, the Theosophical Society, was functioning. And when Krishnamurti was about 34 years old, in the year 1929, he had to disband a worldwide organization which was called the Order of the Star in the East. Now, it had a worldwide membership of 3,000 people, rich and influential people. And Krishnamurti found, according to his discovery and his perception, that all the people in the Order of the Star in the East had actually lost their spiritual way in the wilderness of religious life. And therefore he said, no, that's what it is. It tantamounts to that. And he said, this salvation and freedom is something you're not going to get by following anybody, however mighty and authority he might be. By leaning on him, by depending on him, you're not going to be saved, or you're not going to become free. You've got to start applying yourselves. You've got to think for yourself, and you've got to do a whole lot of serious religious work or spiritual work, and without which you're not going to move an inch forward. Whereas you people are all caught up in a superficial plane where you think that somebody is going to come and wave a magic wand. A world teacher is going to come and he'll wave a magic wand and all of you become enlightened, or some such ridiculous nonsense. So Krishnamurti disbanded this organization, and then he was left all alone. So he started life as a solitary sage without any following, because he did not believe in organized religion. And his lifetime work, right from the age of 16 or 17 till the time he was 90, 1895 to 1986, 91 years was the tenure he spent on planet Earth. And there's a great deal of work in many continents, in India, in Europe, in England, in America, in Australia, and also a little bit in Latin America. So it's a whole lot of work for about 75 years. But what is very interesting about his lifetime work is that he stands outside the dominion of all the world religions. He stands outside the dominion of all the nations. He does not claim to be an Indian, even though he has an Indian passport. And he does not claim to be a Hindu, and that would be anathema to him to declare his credentials as belonging to any religion, because the religions have obviously gone blind, and we have to be honest by speaking the truth and by putting our discoveries on the table, and not by resorting to platitudes and diplomacy and watering down that truth. That's not the way we can move forward. So Krishnamurti stands outside the dominion of all the world religions. He stands outside the dominion of all the nations. And then there is monumental lifetime work. Now,
well, this is interesting because you touched on something I wanted to get to as well. You said monumental lifetime work. And even when you get into even a sort of cursory understanding of the work that's involved in self-knowing. And again, there's been different people that have touched on this to some degree. Gurdjieff talks about the work, the fourth way. Steiner talks about some of the, we talked about Krishnamurti. But it's interesting that the ones who were honest about the scope and necessity of the work, meaning it's lifelong. There is no 2-week course. There's no book or 3 books you read and you've graduated. So it's an interesting sort of window into why those works, yet they still exist and are obviously appreciated. And you talk about Krishnamurti's published in so many languages around the world. His work has been appreciated by millions, tens of millions. But when we get to that, let's say that macrocosm that you're talking about, and penetrating the barrier, the firewall, if you will, that exists between the old and the new in terms of how we see ourselves. One of the things that's interesting to me is that the divide very much seems to exist around how it's presented, and the people who will go out and say, I've got an easy solution for you. Come to church every Sunday and you'll be forgiven and you'll be whatever, or do what we tell you and whatever, or come to our seminar, read the book, pass the course. And the people like Krishnamurti and others who go out and say, well, I've got some news for you. It's a lifelong pursuit. If you start today, you'll never quote unquote be finished, and you'll be continuing to go deeper right up until your last day on this planet and the last breath you take. For a lot of people, that's just not practical enough for them. And so how do we break that wall down between looking for an easy, quick fix and understanding that our very purpose on this planet is to do this work?
You see, we have got to start paying attention. And as a religious teacher and master, Krishnamurti has spoken, as I said, for something like 72, 73 years. And there's a whole lot of, an immense ocean of literature that is there, and YouTube videos which one can watch. And I maintain a certain perspective on this. I say that in order for you to able to get a window into Krishnamurti, it's very, either you have to be a spiritual seeker, which means that's part of your destiny. You begin to seek the truth of religion, or you begin to seek peace, or you begin to seek to understand yourself, or the religions. And that is one starting point, how you can move in that direction. Or you must have a tremendous misfortune in your life, where the world is taken away from you, and your whole world collapses, and then you begin a new kind of inquiry. Or you have crossed the milestone of 60 or 65 years, when you're kind of gotten beyond the temptations of materialistic living, the temptations of the flesh, so to speak, in biblical parlance, and then you become receptive to probably the higher teaching of the religions or the higher wisdom that all philosophers and all masters are wanting to give to mankind. You become sensitive in that area. Under these conditions, these three conditions, that is, firstly, spiritual seeker. Secondly, you've been hit by the missile of misfortune. Thirdly, you're kind of matured with the years and you're crossed 60, 65, and you're approaching death by the year and by the month, when your delusory mind has kind of let go of you. Then under these conditions, you develop a very profound sensitivity to these wisdom teachings or the master, what the master is speaking, and then you open yourself to it. Now, if you're not going to open yourself to it, nobody can spoon feed you, and nobody can initiate you into this. You have to initiate yourself. That is the fortunate thing about it, and it also may be an unfortunate thing for those people who are looking for easy solutions.
And the world we live in is all about easy solutions. So it's one of these sort of catch-22s, in that what we're talking about is something that is, again, it requires patience, requires diligence, requires commitment, requires devotion, requires humility, requires a deep self-inventory. And meanwhile, we're in a world where basically if I can't get it in 30 seconds in the microwave, then I don't want it. So however this world that we're currently living in seems to contradict because it's interesting when you get into the actual practice, and we'll get into some practicality as to some of your practice. We'll talk about obviously self-knowing and your sort of how you would define that. But the interesting parts to me, again, when finding common denominators around the world, stillness, silence, required to then go in and do a sort of a scan, a diagnostic of the inner, to be able to start to focus, to notice, to do self-observation. All these things that are part of a process seem to not fit in a world that is just so overwhelming to the senses, that is literally, I would even say, deliberately trying to pull us out of that in almost all ways. Even if we have a devoted practice and then we go out into the quote-unquote real world, we're almost assailed with everything that pulls at the flesh, like you were talking about earlier. How do you counsel somebody who's been, let's say, a spiritual seeker, who has been looking to understand their true selves, but are frustrated to the point of giving up because they don't see a world that's getting closer to that? They see a world that's getting further away from that.
Right. Richard, you see, it's, as you know very well, and you already sense the truth, the path is not an easy one. And the good news for you, which may also appear to be bad news in another sense for lazy people, is that you have the master key in your own hands. And your own soul is the master key. But the tragedy in the spiritual life is that you're actually doing window shopping and looking for the master key in all the temples, in all the churches, with all the gurus and all the masters and all the religious leaders. You're going there in search of this master key to your life.
And yet you have it.
And you have it. You already have it. That's the good news. But then you have it. To say that you have it is one thing, and it is quite a different matter to actually access it and to live by it.
Yes.
You got to invest yourself. You got to invest yourself. And you see, you can always make an ideal You can say, peace is the thing. You can say, be peaceful. You can say, we are all brothers, so don't hurt each other. Now, all of these are ideals, and they will work only superficially, and they will eventually break down sooner or later, because the self has got a basic disposition. It has got a divisive mentality and a sense of separation in thought and feeling. Now, this is the way the self is designed. It's part of the divine architecture. We've got to recognize it, and we can't gloss over it. We can't pretend that it is not there. As you said, it is. We can go back to Australopithecus and Ramapithecus, the previous species prior to Homo sapiens, and it's always been there. And because it's come with the body, and the body needs to survive. And so long as the self is there, and the self is not understood, is not calmed, tamed, and silenced, the real religious life and the real spiritual life cannot begin. It begins with the calming, with the taming, and the silencing of the self. And so self-knowing has to, first of all, usher us into this. Not a 2-week course, as you said, but it is a very serious quest, which will eventually become a lifelong quest, because you will start taking interest in it. Initially, you may not have suspected, or you may not have expected that it will attract you and it will take you deep within its folds. So you didn't have that understanding, but eventually you yourself will get interested in it, and you yourself will do it, not because somebody compelled you, somebody wanted you to do it, because you see that it is important to be righteous and honest and humble and sane, and to perceive the unity of life everywhere. Without that, probably we are all savages. And you come to a point where you see the imperative need of that, and therefore you invest yourself in that effort.
And I would say that you know, I guess consistent with the adage of necessity is the mother of all invention.
Right.
It's one thing to proactively seek something, but unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to sort of label that, we as a species seem to have a certain modus operandi, which we don't move until our hair is on fire. Meaning, unless it's a crisis, we're not moving, right? Like, we could be shown literally the key to life. Like, here's the meaning to happiness and whatever you could ever want, unless there's an absolute sense of urgency that affects our survival. Again, back to that fight or flight, that survival wiring. We won't really move. We can see that about environmental issues. We can see that about a bunch of other issues. But what I'm seeing, and I'd be curious to see and get your insights and perspective on this, especially from the other side of the world, as the Western world is going through what can only be diagnosed accurately as an anxiety epidemic right now. The numbers are shocking. Like, when you start to go through, you know, especially people from 18 to 34, younger people, well over 50% are reporting that they have missed school or work because of anxiety. The odd sort of dichotomy or contradiction between, let's say, the United States of America, by far the wealthiest country in the world for well over 100 years, by an exponential rate of probably 10. At the same time, leading the world in depression, anxiety, alcoholism, drug addiction, divorce, murder, suicide. All, again, let's pretend we're doctors here. Well, I guess you are a doctor. I'll pretend I'm a doctor. If we were having to diagnose this patient, we would say, well, on all levels, they're dying. At all levels of how you would measure what a healthy body would be, this body is failing. And collectively, at the macro level, the Western world's realization that we got duped. we were told that if you did this and got this and material wealth and got the job and got the car and got the house, we would be happy. And now we find ourselves in this very interesting time where people with more resources than anybody in the history of the world have never been unhappier. And so that, back to the necessity is the mother of all invention, I'm seeing more people than I've ever known or seen in my life starting to move but towards what you're talking about. Not necessarily moving towards it, being pulled or being pushed from the inside, because there's something that thing that's unknowable, unsayable, undescribable, God, the source, the life force, however we want to describe it, is now starting to bubble to the surface almost as survival, because so many people are disenchanted, disillusioned, and unhappy. Is that what you're seeing as well around the world? And I guess to extend that, does that make you optimistic that we're going to, quote unquote, get there together?
What you're saying is actually contemporary reality, and that cannot be contested, because there are facts and figures to authenticate that. And now we've got to understand, we've got to again go back to the etiology. Now this is a social malaise, and we've got to understand how did this social malaise, like the genesis of cancer, for example, which is taking a more physiological example, a physical example.
But probably an accurate one. Because if we were to zoom out to the macro, you could argue there's a cancer in us collectively that has maybe been diagnosed, but we haven't figured out what the cure is, for lack of a better word.
Right. You see, there is macrocosmic society, and then there is a microcosm, which is the consciousness of man, individual man. That's the microcosm. Now, if you take macrocosmic society, then society is not a group of people. It is rather a network of relationships between human beings. It's a network. It's like the Buckminster-Fullerene molecule, where you see large number of atoms with chemical bonds connecting two atoms. And what you see in human relationship transpiring between one individual and another individual. And in that is the story of the health or sickness of those two individuals, whether the relationship can be sustained or whether it's a phony relationship. It's a self-centered relationship, in which case the relationship will break down sooner or later. So when the individual is having an inner discomfort and he's ill at ease with himself, and there is also a macrocosmic malaise in society at large, then unless the individual turns inward, which he has not done up till this point, because the default setting is you're outward looking.
Yes,
you keep on, your senses are outward looking, because that is the default setting, that's part of divine architecture. And unless there's a humongous crisis, you will not turn inward. But you will turn inward when your society is in a deep crisis, and when you yourself are in a deep crisis, then you will have no option but to turn inward. And once you turn inward, then, and you start studying yourself, you start watching the self in movement, and then you will find out that the entire world exists in you, and the social malaise exists in you in the microcosmic realm. And therefore, you will realize the significance of putting your house in order before you venture to put the world into order. So you've got to put your house in order.
But that's a very, I mean, to me, that's very interesting as well, in that, again, semantics, vocabulary sometimes does us a disservice, because we don't necessarily have the ways to, especially when we're talking about the intangible or the non-material. It's very difficult. That's where we often trip up, because there's certain associations with words and whatever, but one of those being self, and then if you extend it, self-ish, right? So there's that other prescriptive thought on the other side that well, too much attention on yourself is selfish, and therefore you should actually be going out and helping people in the world and doing service. Of course, something we both agree, service is very important. But how can you be of service if you haven't done the inner work first? You're going out with a flawed, and not only a flawed sense of self, but generally speaking, the behavior that's going to come from that, whatever, is not actually going to be helpful. Somebody might say, well, actually I'm feeding people at a soup kitchen, but I would, your energy might be that of complete negativity or complete greed or fear or whatever it is. So talk about that importance of being in service collectively. And the most important first step in that process is being in service to the self.
You said it. That's the most important thing. You've got to put your house in order first, and you've got to know yourself. You see, many people are doing many things for the wrong reasons. For example, you can take up service in an ashram or service in a church because it may be enjoined to you by your religious leaders and by your masters, but the fire is not actually coming to you. So you're not actually authentic when you raise your arm and you say, yes, I want to serve. So in that service, there is hypocrisy. On the other hand, once the self, which is initially fragmented, broken, like many pieces of a glass tumbler, they're all broken, and then you throw away all the broken pieces, and then the divine gives you a new self, which has got a quality of wholeness to it, which is unbroken and which is fresh and which is innocent. Now, into the innocent self, depending on what exposure it has to society, can come a calling which is completely authentic, a calling which is inspirational, a calling which is actually in truth given to you by the divine. Then you've got to get into service. But if you've not got the inspirational calling and you're merely functioning at a very superficial level because you want to appear good in the eyes of your religious leader, you want to please the church fathers, so you want to be present there every Sunday and say, I'm a good Christian, I'm interested, or I'm a good Hindu, so I want to come and do at the church. Or you do the service because you have a feeling of guilt. Now, all this is impoverishment of the soul. So you got to begin here, and you got to know the ulterior motives of the self, because the self has got, that's what the self is. It's full of ulterior motives. And then through a study of the self, a new kind of learning will happen. And when the self is calmed and silenced through the process of self-knowing, then there is the awakening of intelligence and the awakening of love. Now that belongs to the divine. That's not your property. But it's just breezing in through your consciousness. Your consciousness is like a portal through which the cosmic love and the cosmic intelligence is breezing in. And then you will act. And you don't look for recognition. You don't look for recognition. You're not waiting for somebody to recognize you and say you're doing great and that kind of a thing. Now, we've got to get human beings into this stream of integrity and authenticity, which is the culmination of self-knowing. It is a culmination of the process of flowering in self-knowing. Then human beings kind of know themselves. So they will not raise their arms when they don't get the call from inside. So they have integrity, they've got honesty, but when they throw themselves in, then my God, it's like throwing 100 people into that act, because they're going to devote themselves completely, entirely, totally.
Wow, and it's one thing to hear that. It's another thing to feel what you were saying. That just absolutely truth resonates, right? I mean, when you really hear and feel truth, it resonates. It's interesting because we're talking about self-knowing. Some people, again, different terminology. Sometimes you're going to hear people talk about the false self, ego, the flesh, the idea, the story, versus the true self, which is the divine. And it's interesting because, again, we kind of almost do everything the opposite. That initial path of exploration or of seeking is usually coming from a place of wanting to fill a hole and or driven by the desire to feel good or feel better. And therefore, we're trying to find something. And what we ultimately find, if we get the right guidance, the right wisdom, and the right devotion, is that it was never about finding something. It was about peeling back the layers of what already is here so that the something that you already have can emerge. Now, interestingly, that is called in many different spiritual practices or religions, death and resurrection. Obviously, quite a familiar concept on the Christianity side, which I think got misinterpreted. But is that a fair assessment to say that true self-knowing can only happen with a letting go, a surrendering, or let's call it a death of a false self for the true self to resurrect and emerge?
Richard, dying and resurrection is certainly the climax. But you've got to learn a great deal before the climax can actually happen to you as an episodal event. Yeah, you've got to go through a whole process, and then the dying and the palingenesia is the technical term for it, coming to life again. Schism and palingenesia. Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, he uses that expression, and Krishnamurti uses the expression, die to that problem. And when you die to it, the whole thing is burnt and it is gone. And then there is a new beginning and there is creation again. Now that has to become a real thing. That has to become a real thing. And for it to become real, we have got to get into the process of self-knowing, and we've got to start learning about ourselves. Now, man has three identities, broadly speaking. He's got a body, which is the most outstanding and conspicuous identity. Then he's got a superficial inner essence, which is the self that I'm talking about, bold italics, in bold italics, superficial inner essence. Now, it is nothing but a series of sensory impressions and sensory likes and dislikes, reactions.
Yes.
I like it, I don't like it. I love you, I hate you, that kind of a thing. Now, this is a superficial thing. Now, far away from this superficial cloud is a core essence of man, which the Hindus have called Atma, and which self-realized Christians will know to be the Christ consciousness. That's the bedrock core of your consciousness, and that is actually belongs to the realm of the divine, and it is the kind of common meeting ground between the human and the divine, whereas the superficial inner essence, the self that I'm alluding to, that is a complete human phenomena. It has got a proneness to evil, and the Parliament of the World's Religions is acknowledging that it has got a proneness to evil. And then it has got a superficial proneness to good. Now, because of its superficial proneness to good, it gets into the evil act, and then it is recommending solutions coming from its superficial leaning towards the good. Now, that's not going to help. Now, unless you come to the core essence of your being, you're not going to be able to solve any of the problems human societies have at the macrocosmic level. You're not going to be able to solve. This is basically bad news, but it is coming from very sound etiology. And we have to go back to ourselves and start doing the homework from there.
Well, I'll use a quote that I think is pretty familiar to a lot of people, and it's the Einstein quote of you can't solve a problem with the same level of consciousness that created the problem. I'm paraphrasing, but you know what I mean. In this case, it's interesting that the prescription that you're talking about here
right.
is that And now why I think this is potentially revolutionary is because I think through the Parliament of World Religions, the discussion now and in November will be about introducing this as not just a solution, not just as something to contemplate if you want to feel better, but literally the only solution for the saving or the extension, or how we want to call it, of the species on this planet. Now, that's not a small statement. How do you see the integration of the institution, the Parliament of World Religions, with your work and desire to forward this notion of inner knowing and self-knowing as being potentially a key cog in the transformation of the macrocosm, let's say, from where we're at to a humanity 2.0, if you will?
Right. As I said, Richard, the Parliament of the World's Religions is a very serious body, and it is concerned with the direction of human civilization, the direction in which it is headed, and this is in a disastrous direction. And the people in the apex body, they're very aware of it, and they're looking for solutions. And I'm saying that the people who are in the creative minority, in the social sphere, in the political sphere, and in the religious sphere, and those people who were originally in the creative minority, now with the disintegration of society and the degeneration of society, that creative minority lost touch with their own souls, and they became dominant minority, because then you use tactics and you use strategies and you use force in order to beat the rank and file into shape. Now, this is what is happening the world over. And this won't work, because there will be a rebellion from the rank and file, because the rank and file have lost their admiration for the masters who were initially very full of charisma, and therefore they were worthy of emulation, but they suffered a moral downfall, and therefore the rank and file are disenchanted with them, and they can no more actually cooperate with them. So there's a kind of a rebellion in society, and the religions, therefore the dominant minority, but I say that even in the dominant minority, in the social sphere, in the political sphere, in the religious sphere, there are some innocent, uncontaminated hearts and souls. Now we have got to work with them. Now they are aware of the social malaise. They know what's gone wrong, and but as lone voices, they may not be able to fix it. A lot of people who are able to appreciate the etiology and what is amiss will have to come together and will have to cooperate. And a whole current of self-knowing must start from the apex of the pyramid and must come to the base of the pyramid. And likewise, another countercurrent of self-knowing must come from the intelligentsia at the base of the pyramid and must move up to the summit of the pyramid. And now this is a work for which we can only sow seeds, like the Master Krishnamurti sowed seeds, like Mahatma Gandhi, he just sowed the seeds, and it may take 10 generations, it may take 20 generations for the whole thing to come to bloom. Because it's an...
Well, I mean, just to that point, like we talked about earlier, it would be disingenuous to suggest that we're a generation away from that level of transformational change. But it's also when we're talking about things that are hundreds of years down the line, perhaps, which is true. I agree with you 100%. I mean, you're talking about, I mean, there's evidence across the board already that, for instance, the slavery in the United States, for instance, that occurred, more than 300 years ago, the effects, the impact of that is imprinted on people's DNA to a level where it's still, a problem, 7, 8, 10 generations 20 generations later. So
Right.
whatever the effects are of living through the false self, as we have the you know, the death, the war, the social malaise, the repression, the oppression, the trauma. It is not something that is like a light switch. That has its requirement to be able to transform as well from, you know, pain to forgiveness, whatever it is. When we're talking about, let's say, the upside of this shift, some people will say, well, I just don't think it's in us. I don't think human beings have, I think history shows that we don't have the ability to be able to coexist on a planet where we have so many differences in religion, in ethnicity, etc. But how do we get, though, do we try to convince people who are not predisposed to even understanding that there is a false self and a true self, or is the more efficient and more practical and ultimately more effective way is to mobilize those hearts and souls you talked about earlier? Maybe they're 1 out of 100, maybe they're 1 out of 1,000, but to have those people working together, perhaps under the umbrella of a Parliament of World's Religion type organization, and the effects of that energy transforming and transcending, almost like a tipping point. Is that a realistic model, let's say, for the implementation of what you're talking about?
You see, Richard, you're asking very good questions, and you have a broad grasp of what's going on in the world. And you know that our world is becoming more and more unhappy. And the only good news in all this is that quite a large section of humanity is also begun to search for the truth.
Agreed. Yeah.
And you may not be able to lay your hands on the truth overnight, but a search is definitely underway, and it is taking many forms, very diversified forms. And the Parliament of the World's Religions itself, they've got a program of training religious leaders. Now, right now, they're doing it only for Christian religious leaders, sensitizing Christian religious leaders to the existence and the philosophy and the outlook of all the other religions in the world. Now there has to be a lot of give and take and a lot of understanding, not just on the outer plane, but one has to turn inward, and each of us will have to do tremendous amount of work with ourselves. And I conduct international retreats where 20 or 25 people attend these retreats, where people, they've had misfortunes, or they are spiritual seekers, or they are 60, 65 plus, and they see sense in the pursuit of self-knowledge, so that sorrow will be exorcised from their life. So I began in a small way at an individual level. Now this has to enter into mainstream in a bigger way, but without the cooperation of others, of leaders in our society, social leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, it is not likely to develop a significant momentum. And therefore one has to see, for example, the panel, the panelists who are with me, they are all people who have been in touch with me. Lakshmi Kumar, if you take, he has known me for the last 20 years, 20 odd years, nearly 25 years. And Madhu Sai, he has known me for 20 years. And Marsha, Dawn, and LaMor, they're in touch with me from 2014 onwards, and they're closely following the work. So this is kind of a new beginning, inspired by the lifetime work of the Master Krishnamurti, and we have to be very patient, and we have to accept responsibility. You and me have to accept responsibility for all the evil that is happening all over the world.
I love that. Yeah, accountability, though, is very difficult for people to say, well, because the default is, what do you mean? I didn't do anything. I'm a good person. What do you mean when you say you and me and everybody have to accept responsibility for that?
Because you see, when once you turn inward and you start observing the self, you will find that the self has a proneness to evil, it has got a proneness to good. Now, this is recognized by the Parliament of the World's Religions in their manifesto, which is called Declaration of the Global Ethic, which was penned by Professor Hans Kuhn, who was a Swiss Catholic theologian. And it's a very, very profound document. It is a quintessential wisdom of all the religions. And there they've almost put their finger on where the root problem is, but not quite. They are saying that every form of egoism has to be renounced, whether it is at the individual level or at the collective level. Now, this is a very significant statement.
Yes,
then they're also going on to say that together we can move mountains. Now, do we want more than this?
I think that's a pretty good start. I mean, to find any organization actually talking about ego, period, at an institutional level about part of a macro solution is long overdue. It's incredible to me how seldom it's even brought up in high-level intellectual and academic conversations, and as though it's just a small component of the problem, when it's literally the problem, the false self. And that's, again, there's some light coming in on that. And I'll leave you with this, or we'll come to an end on this point. You mentioned you know, the history of India in terms of, you know, 100 years plus, you know, for multiple different religions to coexist harmoniously within the same sort of geographic area. I mean, anybody who's familiar with theological history or even scripture for that matter would know that the Middle East that we know of over the last 100 years or last 70, 80 years was not actually how it used to be back in the day. And in fact, there were times in history where Jews and Muslims and Christians all coexisted in the same geographical area somewhat harmoniously with, you know, with different levels of ebbs and flows over the years, but certainly far better than we do today. So we know it's happened before in history. Let me ask you to indulge me as again we come to the end, and let's pretend we can fast forward and we have been successful. Inner knowing is self-knowing work is happening everywhere, and it's a couple hundred years later, and we've managed to transcend the problems of divisiveness, ego, and false self that have held down the progression of real you know, Christ consciousness, divinity, humanity, Atma. What does that world look like to you? If we were to jump in a time machine, how do we see that world? How do we envision that world?
That is clearly the world of light. It is it is heaven on earth. And if you and I, we don't actually see the necessity of it, and we don't actually commit ourselves to it, and we don't work for it, it may not happen. Because as I said, I'll go back to the original statement, the key is with us, the master key. And the master key is not with the Pope, it is not with the Shankaracharyas in India, it is not with the highest religious authorities in every religion, it is with us. Now, we have got to access it. And all the religions, especially the deeper aspect of every religion, is concerned with imparting this knowledge to man, right? That is what the religions are. Because look at the etymology of that word religion. It means re plus ligere. That is to bind you back to the source from which we have been broken off because of creation. So we have to go back home. So, that's where we'll be happy. And home is here. The kingdom of God is here. It's not a very exciting external world with sensory stimulation and sensory excitement. No, it's here. And the self is the serpent in the Garden of Eden. That's the self.
Can I show you something really quickly, just as an almost uncanny synchronicity of what you just said? Let me know if you guys can see this. This is on my wall. This is something that I meditate to on a daily basis. If you'll see the serpent on top of the serpent, and what's behind the true self, the serpents, who throughout history have represented, I believe, that false self, that ego, that those temptations, whatever we want to call it, the devils, the demons. But if you look inside beyond the physical, we'll see a light, we'll see a kundalini, if you will, an energy that seems to be what we're talking about, right? At the end of the day, you sort of touched on the kingdom of God is within you, which is, you know, something that was unfortunately, I think, misunderstood. And know thyself.
Know thyself. Right.
Know thyself. I mean, we've seen and heard that, and again, not necessarily understood that, but now, at least I think with the work you're doing around self-knowing, around what the Parliament of the world's religions are doing, we are pointed in a direction that I think we could all agree on is a direction that could get us ultimately to that heaven on earth that you described earlier. But it requires patience, it requires devotion, it requires commitment, and it requires honest introspection and the ability to be, frankly, brutally honest with who we are as selves, which is not easy for everyone to do, but they'll certainly have an easier time to do it the more they understand the work that you're doing. Where can people find the work that you're doing these days? And also, where can people know more about the Parliament of the world's religions?
The Parliament of the world's religions, they have got a website which gives all the history of the organization and old videos. And the internet is carries also the momentous address of Swami Vivekananda. And every 3 years, every 5 years, there is an international meet. The previous meet was probably in Salt Lake City, Utah. And then it was in Australia. And then the 1993 meet was in Chicago again after 100 years. And so there's abundant material available. And one can access a huge number of links and genuine sources, and one can see all that. My website is also there. And just one point, Richard, the yogic figure you showed me, that is the awakening of Kundalini. Now, this Kundalini is the auspicious energy of the divine, but the serpent in the book of Genesis in the Bible, where the fall of Adam is described, that serpent is not in good light because it brings about the fall of man. That is the self. And
this is the serpent that we all have in us, the dark and the light, as you talked about earlier, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, I'll do my best to honor the commitment I make by this conversation we're having with you, to be accountable, to start with the person in the mirror, and to do the sometimes difficult, often difficult, but clearly vital, important self-inventory, introspection, and looking inwards as we all try to continue to be of service. And as we said earlier, there's no better way to be of service than to ultimately do the very important work in terms of self-knowing. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Sankara. We will see you in November in Toronto at the event for the Parliament of the World's Religions. I look forward to seeing you again in person. Thank you very much for your time today.
It was a great joy to speak to you, Richard. And you asked me very good questions. And I look forward to meeting you in person in Toronto. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste. Namaste.